It was 27 years ago when then Commander Frank Powell and former Supreme Court Justice I. Beverly Lake Sr. requested that Governor Jim Martin proclaim Confederate Flag Day as an annual commemoration and celebration of our rich history and heritage. And we have celebrated this day, one of three each year, when our flags fly atop this state capitol ever since. It seems that each week brings news of one more collapse, one more cave, one more disappearance of another piece of our heritage. Some of you will remember maybe 35 years ago when the local television station WRAL used to sign off at night with a beautiful rendition of Dixie. Now that station looks at Confederate heritage at best as a kind of curiosity, something to be barely tolerated but mostly consigned to a museum, dead and gone. At worst, even the word Confederate for Channel 5 is now equivalent to the word hate.
I find it offensive. After 160 years, why don't they let it go?
Quoted in the Sanford Herald as saying he was furious and felt violated, compromised, and targeted.
It is not just the mass media and the influx of newer residents who have no idea of our history. It is our own fellow Tar Heels in many cases who have developed a kind of historical amnesia, or due to our disastrous public school system, I should say our miseducational system and entertainment media, they are actually ashamed of our history and our culture. We are reduced to a remnant in many ways as we watch those symbols and beliefs dear to us and prized by our parents only a generation ago disappear, and to be replaced by, pardon my French, garbage and trash that calls itself culture. Think about it. While most college freshmen know all about there is to know about Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, according to certain polls, 70% have no idea when World War II took place, much less that there are three branches of the federal government. But don't worry. They can't read or write either. Welcome to the US of A, 2015, left to us as an inheritance of Southern defeat in 1865. Yet we must have, and we do have, hope. Where have we heard that? Keep hope alive. Because we know that those beliefs and that heritage that we cherish and defend are indeed truthful and worthy of our devotion and dedication. Throughout history, it has been almost always a dedicated remnant armed with conviction and resilience that eventually succeeds. And so it is with us today. If we hold fast, if we do our duty, St. Matthew's parable of the talents, we use our talents, pass on our inheritance and legacy to our children and their children. Even if we must spend generations in a modern catacomb, we can and we will be successful. Our heritage, our history can and will survive. As God is our witness, we know this to be true. It's not an easy undertaking. Each one of us has a role to play, and we must play it. And that is why today I have great pleasure in introducing our guest speaker, a gentleman, a man of learning, a noted academic, a professor of philosophy. I should also mention a South Carolinian, a man who taught for many years at Emory University, professor of philosophy, who now heads what I consider to be the premier institution of learning Southern culture, the Abbeville Institute. Dedicated his life not only to defending our traditions and heritage, but also passing them on intelligently through his writings and his work and his teachings. He understands that the battles we fight will go on and that we must persevere despite the odds against us. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor then, my distinct honor and pleasure, to introduce Dr. Donald Livingston, our speaker for this, our 27th annual Confederate Flag Day, and his topic for us, Jeffersonian Americanism and the Confederacy. Dr. Livingston.
It's a great honor. It really is a great honor to be invited to speak to you this afternoon. The Institute, very briefly, was formed 12 years ago because we were concerned that the Southern tradition is no longer being taught in higher education. There are courses on the South, but they are taught as the function of the needs of political correctness. They're not taught from the South's own inner life. And that's not going to change unless scholars produce the books and teach the next generation. We're in a culture war, and culture wars are won by ideas. They're not won by bullets, though bullets sometimes are involved. And so that's what we've done. Now today we have over 160, I can't remember exactly how many, they keep growing, academics in the Institute from all over the country. There's a few in Europe. We do an annual summer school for college students. It's college and graduate students we're interested in. And we do an annual conference for academics. We've produced over 50 books. I don't have the exact count. So I urge you to get on the website and look at abbevilleinstitute.org and see what we're doing and see if it's something you'd like to support. It really is a great honor to be invited to speak to you this afternoon, especially in this chamber where the legislators voted after considerable thought to rescind the treaty they had made with the other states that created that artificial corporation called the United States and to resume their sovereign powers of self-government. Now, the legislators who met here had enjoyed a political liberty that we could have a hard time imagining. They left the Federation. And they could do this because they had a certain understanding of what the Federation was. And I'm going to call that Jeffersonian Americanism. And what I want to talk about is something we've forgotten. We need to understand what kind of world they lived in, what kind of society they enjoyed, why they thought it was in danger, and what kind of society they hoped to build once they left this suffocating Federation. And then I want to make a few suggestions of how that sort of society, to some degree, not entirely, but to some degree, might be recovered in our time. Now, all of us here have inherited two incompatible visions of America. I'm going to symbolize these as Jeffersonian Americanism and Lincolnian Americanism. If anyone is an American, Jefferson is. And if anyone is an American, Lincoln is. But their visions of political order are absolutely incompatible. And this means everyone here who has inherited both of these traditions has that tension within them. When you have a tension like that, you have to try to first understand it, that it's there, and secondly, you have to try to understand what to do about it. These two visions were there from the very beginning of the Constitution, and they clashed in the bloodiest war of the 19th century, and they're still with us today. For the Jefferson, boiled down to the simplest terms, we can explain the difference this way. For the Jeffersonians, the Constitution is a compact between distinct sovereign states, creating a central government to which were delegated a few enumerated powers, mainly foreign treaties, defense, adjudication of quarrels between states, a postal service, coining money, weights, measures, and regulating interstate commerce. Other than that, everything else was left to the states. Now, since the states had these reserved powers, and they were not defined, and they were not enumerated, only the states could say what they are. So they alone were able to protect themselves. Madison said a state could interpose to protect its citizens from federal tyranny. And Jefferson said a state could lawfully nullify what it considered intrusions into its reserved powers. And if necessary, it could withdraw from the Union. Now, Jeffersonian Americanism dominated from the Declaration of Independence, which of course is a secession document, up to 1860 when South Carolina actually did secede. During this period, state nullification and secession in some form or other were considered options in every section of the Union. Now, the Lincolnian vision flatly contradicts the Jeffersonian vision at every point in the foundation, for it denies that the states are or ever were sovereign political societies. It holds that the American people in the aggregate are sovereign, and that the Constitution is not a compact between sovereign states, but a national constitution where the central government is supreme and where the states function in a way similar to counties. Indeed, Lincoln compared the states explicitly to counties. If a state in one instance and a county in another should be equal in extent of territory and equal in the number of people, wherein is that state any better than a county? Can a change of name change the right? End quote. Now, Southerners reasoned that a man who couldn't tell the difference in 1861 between a county and an American state probably wasn't qualified to be president. If states are not sovereign political societies, then Lincoln is right, that they cannot lawfully nullify acts of the central government as unconstitutional, nor can states secede from the Union, any more than a county of North Carolina can lawfully do those things regarding the state of North Carolina. Lincolnians agree with Jeffersonians that the states enjoy reserved powers. But for Lincolnians, what those powers are and what are the remedies for usurpation of those powers by the central government is to be defined by the central government. States have reserved rights, but the central government will tell you what they are. And if the central government is tyrannical, the only remedy for the Lincolnian would be national elections. Whereas for the Jeffersonian, if the states find themselves under tyranny, they have the authority to both define what that tyranny is and to provide remedies for it. What those remedies are is a nice question, but they have the authority to do that. Now, the Lincolnian vision did not take root until after the war between the states. The Jeffersonians dominated up to that time. Today, it is the dominant view. But the earlier Jeffersonian vision is still a vital force in American political thought today. And today, it is beginning to reassert itself, as we'll see later. In order to understand what a revived Jeffersonian America might look like, we need to review the basic outlines of the Jeffersonian Americanism that dominated from 1776 to 1861. Jefferson's election was described at the time as the, quote, revolution of 1800, end quote. It was a revolution because it was in opposition to the centralizing tendencies urged by Hamilton and implemented in the Washington and Adams administration. Now, Jefferson's revolution was founded on state sovereignty and the claim that the 10th Amendment is the foundation of the Constitution. An important plank in this platform was fiscal reform. This is very important. The Anti-Federalists before had argued that the central government should have no original taxing power. That was to be reserved to the states. They failed to build that prohibition into the Constitution. And as a consequence, the first problem confronting the United States was a tax revolt. No sooner was it formed than there was a tax revolt, the Whiskey Rebellion. Jefferson ran for president on a platform that if he were elected, he would abolish all inland federal taxes. The federal government would then live mainly off a tariff on imports and to a lesser extent on selling Western land. And from Jefferson's election until the secession of South Carolina, Americans paid no direct taxes to the federal government, except for a brief period of taxation to pay for the War of 1812. Jefferson also inveighed against public credit. He urged reforms in which future generations would have a lawful way to repudiate debts imposed on them by profligate actions of earlier generations. He also sought to get the central government out of debt. In this, he did not succeed, but Andrew Jackson, another Jeffersonian, did succeed in destroying the Bank of the United States in 1835, which would be the equivalent of destroying the Federal Reserve today. Okay, for the first time in American history, the central government was out of debt. And stayed close to that goal up to 1861, except for an easily managed debt incurred to cover the Mexican War. That debt was $65 million, less than the total expenditures of the federal government in 1858. So there was virtually no debt. There had never been anything in the world like Jeffersonian America. White Americans enjoyed more individual and political liberty than any people in the world then or ever had. The people of Europe talked of liberty, but they were burdened with taxes and loaded with debt. They stood in fear of vast standing armies possessed by great monarchies. Americans paid no direct federal taxes, and they were virtually out of debt, and they didn't fear a large standing national army because there wasn't one. The sword was mainly in the hand of the state militias. The central government's expenditure on the eve of Lincoln's invasion of the South was less than 2% of GNP. Today, it is more than 35%. And the states mimic the central government. So if you add that, you've got an even larger number of government control. Now, this spectacular shift of power from 2% of GNP to 35%, or over 35%, is a consequence of what we might call the Lincolnian Revolution of 1865, which overthrew the Jeffersonian Revolution of 1800. Okay, let's look more carefully at Jeffersonian America. In wealth, it equaled that of Europe, and it was more evenly distributed, the wealth was. As a young country, its cultural achievements were not equal to Europe, but its literacy rate was higher, and it was beginning to make a mark in the arts and sciences. Those in Europe who aspired to republican government saw America as a model to emulate. Now, in Europe at that time, every country was a monarchy except Switzerland, arguably maybe Holland. But republicanism was desired all over Europe. The language was there, and there was discontent. And the Europeans looked to America as a model. Switzerland, for example, changed its constitution in 1848 from a loose confederation to a federal system of states in emulation of Jeffersonian America. Like the Anti-Federalists and the Jeffersonians later, the Swiss were worried about giving the central government original taxing power. So their constitution prohibited it. That's what the Anti-Federalists wanted. The Swiss did it. Even today, the central government in Switzerland may tax only for a certain period of time and at a certain rate. After that period, it has no taxing power whatsoever. It can regain it only by a constitutional amendment. And that requires a majority of the cantons, the little states, and a majority of the individuals. A further limit on the Swiss central government is that only 50,000 signatures are needed to put any federal law up to referendum. You can pass a federal law, but you've got to worry about the referendum. And with 100,000 signatures, you can force a vote on a constitutional amendment. This is called government by the people. Now, another federation influenced by Jeffersonian America is Canada, the peaceable kingdom to our north. The Canadian provinces have the constitutional right of state nullification and secession. A Canadian province may nullify any federal law in the area of civil rights within its borders. In other words, it can opt out. The other provinces will accept it maybe, but it can opt out. And every Canadian province has a right to a public referendum on secession whenever it wishes. The Supreme Court has ruled that, but they have it anyway, it doesn't matter. Both of these are denied to Americans by the Lincolnian vision. For the Lincolnian, state nullification is treason, and so is secession. Now, how did Canada get these rights? It's an interesting story, and I'll just touch on parts of it. Judah Benjamin, who was Secretary of State in the Confederacy, second highest position, fled to England after the war and became a distinguished barrister. He took up and won a number of cases for the Canadian provinces, and as a result, planted states' rights principles in Canadian common law. So in 1982, when the Canadians worked out their own constitution, they included these nullification rights in it. A friend of mine who was a Canadian senator, John Stewart, once told me there's a saying in Canada that the South, having lost the war in America, won it in Canada, where they talk about nullification and secession quite often. Quebec in 1995, by a vote of 51 to 49, voted not to secede, but they could have. Further, Jeffersonian America was remarkable for its entrepreneurship. And this is something that you just don't hear about in our popular history. The South had the fourth largest economy in the world. Nobel laureate Robert Fogel co-authored with Stanley Ingerman a study of the economics of the Old South, titled Time on the Cross. They argued that white Southern agriculture was more productive than Northern, and that plantation agriculture was more productive than either. I mean, the old story was that plantation agriculture was not productive. Simply not true. But this productivity in plantation agriculture was not possible without training and giving considerable responsibility to the black labor force. Fogel points out that most overseers were black, they were not white. And slaves were encouraged to increase production through pecuniary incentives and promotion to positions of status. Some planters left management of the entire plantation to slaves who purchased supplies, planted, harvested, and sold the crops, with the owner receiving a certain amount of the profits. It makes sense. If you want that high productivity, you can't get it by cracking the lash. You have to get it by the self-interest of the slaves. Ben Montgomery managed the plantation of Jefferson Davis's brother. He was taught many skills, architecture, land surveying, and he invented an ingenious propeller for steamships. But he was denied a patent from the federal government because he was a slave. He was again denied the patent after the war when he wasn't a slave by the Yankees. By contrast, Jefferson Davis got established the Confederate law that allowed slaves to own patents and make money off them. The South had more miles of railroad than any country in the world except the North. The Southern states outranked the Northern states in per capita income. That is to say, every Southern state was higher, really higher. And this is true even if you factor in the income of the slaves. Even then, they're higher. When have you heard that last? Mississippi had the highest per capita income in America, and the South was second. Now, of course, after the war, all of that was turned upside down. Mississippi was the last, South Carolina next to last, and up you went. Tremendous, tremendous revolution and confiscation of property. One thing, what did Southerners do with this wealth? One thing they did was educate their young people. According to historian Frank Owsley, quote, "The South had more educated men and women in proportion to white population than the North, or any other country in the world." Any other country in the world. According to the 1860 census, there was one college student for every 247 white inhabitants in the South. In the North, it was one college student for every 703. 247 to 703. In 1836, Wesleyan College in Macon, Georgia was the first college in the world chartered to give women advanced degrees. The South's 260 colleges represented half the total number of colleges in the United States. Now, some of these were smaller, but William E. Dodd, historian, points out that in the decade between 1850 and 1860, quote, "practically every Southern college and university doubled in attendance," end quote. Doubled. They had about half the colleges anyway. The numbers doubled. So the South was going through a tremendous economic boom, and this was represented in this flourishing of education. Southern culture, unlike Northern, favored a cosmopolitan education in elite institutions. Very early, the North started abandoning the classics, and they concentrated on theological literature and then theological education, and later on technical education. But the South kept studying the classics. Most Southerners were educated in elite institutions of Europe and the North. Rich planters, especially those in South Carolina, sent their sons to Eton, Oxford, and the Middle Temple. Of the 350 Americans admitted to the Inns of Court in London before 1860, nearly 2/3 were from the South. Northern schools such as Yale and Harvard had large contingents of Southerners. Nearly half the students at Princeton in 1850 were from the South. From the earliest days, Southern colleges and universities stressed study of the Greek and Latin classics. Robert E. Lee could give the Greek exam at Washington College, whereas the North began abandoning them in the 17th century. Francis Butler Simpkins observed, quote, "The devotion of Southern students to the classics and their participation in recitations and debates of the literary societies accounts to a large degree for the grace of manner, classical allusions, and flowing melody of the Old South's numerous orators," end quote. A classical education also tends to help make you immune to ideology, because the classic Greek and Latin texts are all mainly concerned about character. This classical education was in part responsible for the amazing leadership that Southerners enjoyed in Jeffersonian America. Now, Jeffersonian America was not Southern. It was all over America. I mean, it couldn't have dominated unless the other states supported it. But it was run by Southerners. From the founding to 1860, there were 11 presidents from the South, only 5 from the North. Attorney generals, 14 from the South, only 5 from the North. Supreme Court justices, 17 from the South, 11 from the North. Speakers of the House, 21 from the South, only 12 from the North. This flourishing economy and society was destroyed root and branch by Lincoln's invasion and his decision to turn the war on civilians at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, having failed to win it on the battlefield. It cannot be stressed too strongly that the Lincoln administration did not launch an invasion to free slaves. A thoroughly white supremacist Lincoln and Congress went out of their way to insist that emancipation was not a war aim. The aim of the war from the beginning to the end was to prevent 11 American states from seceding to form a federation of their own. The reason for invasion was simply that the Northern industrial ruling class was determined to dominate the continent economically and politically. The war, the figures have increased somewhat today, cost around 1 million lives if civilian deaths are included and the indirect deaths of war. Tremendous. That would be about 10 million people today. A Holocaust. This was a great tragedy, and surely this is the most sanitized war in history. This was a great tragedy because the best solution to all the problems facing the Union in 1860 was a negotiated separation. That was also the most American solution if we think of America under the Jeffersonian vision of it. The 19th century was an age of unabashed imperial wars and state building. Everybody was doing that. Everywhere, smaller polities were crushed violently into larger and larger and larger centralized states, such as revolutionary France, Bismarck's Germany, Cavour's Italy, and Lenin's Soviet Union. Lincoln's invasion and war of conquest was right on schedule with the rest of Europe. Nothing unusual about it. To understand why the South seceded, you need only read the Confederate Constitution. Southerners could see a ruling class emerging in the North that was tone deaf to the restraints imposed by the constitutions their fathers had ratified. By seceding, they did not intend to come up with a new constitution. Rather, they brought the old constitution with them and simply reformed it in a more Jeffersonian manner to protect the states. Let me give you some examples, because this is what we can really learn from. Southerners learned from their bad experience in the Union that the best way to prevent tyranny in the federal government is to restrain its ability to raise and spend money. Turn the money off, and you don't get the corruption. Or at least turn it down. First, the Constitution required a high bar of 2/3 of both houses for a spending bill. Second, the bill had to be for one and only one item as stated in its title. This eliminated tacking on earmarks and pork spending, which had nothing to do with the bill. Third, bills to fund federal internal improvements, such as railroads, canals, were prohibited. These projects were to be funded by private enterprise and the states. Fourth, bills to subsidize business corporations were prohibited. Fifth, the federal government could spend money to improve the means of commerce, such as building roads, cleaning out harbors, lighthouses, but it was reimbursed by a user fee paid by those who used it. Sixth, federal contracts with cost overrun provisions were prohibited. And seventh, the president was given a single 6-year term and the line item veto. So they hedged that baby in. It'll be hard to engage in corrupt spending. The Confederate Constitution also gave the states increased power to check federal tyranny. First, any state, by a 2/3 vote of both houses, could impeach any federal official operating within its borders to be tried in the Confederate Senate. So the federal officials were told, behave yourself. And second, this is the most, I think, important reform of all, any 3 states could initiate a constitutional amendment. And the other states would have to vote it up or down, and it took only 2/3 of the states rather than 3/4. Amazing thing. If that measure had been in place today, the states would have the final say on how to interpret the Constitution and not the Supreme Court. The Constitution does not give the court power over gay marriage, abortion, school prayer, and so on. These are powers made up by the court's own Alice in Wonderland reading of the 14th Amendment. Third, new states could enter the Confederacy, and they thought new states would. They thought many of the Midwestern states would want to join. But it required a two-thirds majority of both houses for a state to come in. Under the U.S. Constitution, a mere majority of Congress is all that's needed to admit a state. That's a very bad rule, because to bring a new state in is destabilizing. It creates new majorities and new minorities. It's a stupid rule. And it helped bring on the war because they fought over these new states, one after another. Consider this example, the annexation of Texas. Now, Texas was a foreign country, so it could be annexed only by a treaty with the United States to be confirmed by two-thirds of the Senate. Well, you know what the vote was? Two-thirds voted against it. So is Texas going to be part of the United States? No. How can it be? And those who voted against it would probably be doing so for decades. So to get around this, Congress said, well, if we got a simple majority of both houses, that would be good enough. And that was considered unconstitutional by the northern states. It passed by only 2 votes in the Senate. John Quincy Adams argued that New England should secede from the Union. That this was a case of the Southerners trying to stack the thing against New England, and they were in a large degree right. The Confederate Constitution eliminated that problem by requiring two-thirds of both houses. It's going to be hard to bring a state in. And that would also protect the culture of the Confederacy. Wouldn't just let anybody in. I turn now to Lincolnian Americanism. Having excluded state interposition and secession, the only remedy it offers to federal tyranny is national elections. That's it. You don't like the Supreme Court? Then put a party in that will put the right people on. States have no say in protecting themselves against federal tyranny on the Lincolnian view. Now, this might work. National elections might be all right if there were an adequate representation in the Congress. If the representation is not adequate, then national elections are an illusion. Let's just look and see. Are they adequate? Adequate representation requires a proper ratio between population and the number of representatives. For example, Madison and many of the founders thought the proper ratio was one representative in the House for every 30,000 people. Some thought one for 40,000. And that was about how they thought. As population, and we know this from the earliest draft of the Bill of Rights, as population increased, the number of representatives should also increase. If we go beyond one for 30,000, if we get 60,000, then we need 2 representatives. But in 1910, Congress kept representation in the House at 435, where it remains today. Since then, our population has increased to around 319 million, yielding a ratio of 1 representative for every 750,000 people. That's a meaningless ratio of representation. But by mid-century, there might well be 435 million Americans in America, in which case there'll be 1 representative in the House for every 1,000,000 people. Are the civics teachers going to tell their students, write your congressman, let your views be known, get involved. You can't complain about what happens if you don't, write your congressman. Well, good luck. 1 representative every 1,000,000 people. In short, as population increases, the quality of representation in the United States diminishes. What are we to do? It will not do to increase the size of the House. There's a limit to lawmaking bodies. If you look around the world, the largest one is in Britain with 630-something, and they range from around 200 to 600. So 435 is about right for a lawmaking body. And if we increased the number according to Madison's ratio, there would be 10,500 members in the House. A gaggle. Well, it already is a gaggle, but 10,000, it's a village, it's a town, a little town. Too big. But what do we need to conclude from this? That Madison's ratio is wrong for representation, or that the United States has grown so large that representative government at the national level is simply no longer possible? You know, when a person weighs 600 pounds, there's just things that can't be done. And when the government becomes obese like this, it just can't function as a representative body. It's not that it's difficult to function, it can't. Now, to fully understand how absurd our ratio is of one representative for every 735,000, imagine if that ratio were used in the first Congress, 1789, when the population was 4 million people. In that case, there would be only 5 members in the House. 5 of the 13 states would have 1 representative each, but 8 states would have no representation at all. And that precisely is the quality of representation in the House today. It's just that bad. But notice, have you ever heard anybody present this? I doubt it. I mean, this is not any bright idea of mine, but you see, we just don't think about it. Our attention is somewhere else. We don't think about size and scale. But the Confederates did. So the founders. They messed up on it, by the way, but anyway. Now, or to look at it another way, the 5 great countries of Europe, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain, each has a better ratio than we do. Britain, for example, has 64 million people with a ratio of 1 representative for every 44,000, which is not too far from Madison's. Or to put it another way, the combined population of the 5 European countries is 319 million, the same as the United States. So those 5 countries are the same size. But their combined representatives, including their upper and lower houses, totals 7,571, whereas ours is 535. America has the least representative government of any democracy in the world. The least. The worst. And that's not a hysterical claim, that's just the number. But it's worse than that. As bad as this lack of representation in Congress is, it's not the worst. For most of the laws we live under are not passed by Congress at all, but spring from the vast, impenetrable bureaucracy under the control of the president. Nor is that all. Fundamental social policy, such as the place of religion in society, gay marriage, education, and 100 other topics like that, are not decided in state legislatures where the Constitution places them, but by 9 unelected, politically well-connected lawyers on the Supreme Court. But there's more. The Jeffersonians, from the Anti-Federalists to the Confederacy, sought to prevent federal tyranny by restricting the ability of Congress to tax, spend, print, and borrow money. Remember, that was one of their main things. Once the states were removed as checks on national power, an enormous and bloated deposit of patronage was created. For example, the railroads were given territory equal to the state of Germany. That's pretty good if you're a railroad man. Consider this, a lawmaking majority of the House and Senate plus the president is only 269 people. And if a quorum is used, it can be as low as 135. This small number rules some 319 million people, a number 5 times larger than the Roman Empire at its height. Last year, the small number spent nearly $4 trillion, an amount greater than the gross national product of Germany. Never in human history has so much financial power been placed in the hands of so few. Federal debt has reached $18 trillion, an amount equal to the country's GNP. Recall that when Jeffersonians governed America under Southern leadership, most Americans paid no direct federal taxes at all, and from 1835 to 1860, there was hardly any federal debt. That actually existed. That's not a philosopher's utopia. That was the United States under Jeffersonian guidance. Jefferson wrote to Gideon Granger in 1800, the year of his election to the presidency, quote, "Our country is too large to have all its affairs governed by a single government. Public servants at such a distance will invite the public agents to corruption, plunder, and waste. And I do verily believe that if the principle were to prevail of a common law being enforced in the United States, which reduces us to a single consolidated government, it would become the most corrupt government on the earth," end quote. In other words, the sheer size of the thing, if centralized, would make it corrupt. Now, I don't know whether the representatives in Congress are more corrupt than those in Bolivia or Venezuela, but certainly the scale of corruption today is unprecedented, as Jefferson said it would be. According to Harvard economic historian Niall Ferguson, the U.S. has an unfunded liability. I mean, the funded liability involves the full faith and credit of the United States. The unfunded liability, like Social Security, are things promised and are politically obligatory.
Neil Ferguson, who's the author of The Great Degeneration, How Institutions Decay and Economies Die.
Where do we stand? What's your view of what's going on in Washington?
Well, I'm no Beltway insider, but just from the vantage point of a historian, it is pretty extraordinary that the idea of the default of the United States on its debt is seriously being discussed on shows like this. That's not healthy. What worries me is that both sides are in really uncompromising positions now. It's a little bit like a game of Russian roulette, except it's being played next to a fuel dump. And I think the politicians may be underestimating just how much of a risk they're taking. One of the arguments I had recently with Mr. Krugman was about the Congressional Budget Office's long-term budget forecasts, which conceivably could take our debt up towards 190% of GDP in just 25 years' time. We need to address the problem of entitlements, especially the soaring costs of health care.
The government shutdown, the dysfunction in Washington, has become the #1 concern of voters at 33%.
The unfunded liability of the United States tops out at $238 trillion. $238 trillion. Larry Kolitoff places it, another economist, places it at $220 trillion. What are a few trillion among friends? I don't know, 220 trillion, 238 trillion. And he says that, quote, "The United States is arguably in worse financial shape than any other developed country," end quote. Now, to gain some perspective on the sheer size and scale of this corruption, consider that the GDP of all countries in the world combined last year was just $72 trillion. That's everybody. About a third of the central government's unfunded liability, if Ferguson and Kolitoff are right. I don't know whether they're right or not, but they're distinguished economists. Now, it is unlikely that any conceivable arrangement of national elections can restrain the momentum of centralization that is built into the very DNA of Lincolnian Americanism. The only remedy is some form of state interposition or nullification whereby the sovereign people of the several states gradually, and they have to do this prudently and gradually, begin to recalling those reserved powers they have absent-mindedly allowed to slip out of their hands. So we are not in the same kind of chamber that our ancestors were in 1861. This constitutional path is again being explored today in the growing 10th Amendment movement and in the move to call a convention of the states under Article 5. The states could call a convention of the states and amend the Constitution and bypass Congress and the President. They would have no say in it. Remember, the Confederates required only 3 states to do that. We require 2/3. But at least that avenue is there, though it's an uphill task. But there's also a growing disposition in America to consider the Jeffersonian option of secession. Public Policy Polling, a respected polling outfit, conducted a survey asking those interviewed whether they would like to see their state secede. 18% of Americans favored secession. But what's interesting is the breakdown. Of the 18 to 29-year-olds, 29% favored secession and 21% not sure. Hispanics, 27% favored secession, 19% not sure. Blacks, 12% favored secession, 16% not sure. Among those identified as, quote, very conservative, 37% favored secession and 15% not sure. Those who are somewhat conservative, 23% favored secession, 18% not sure. Among the very liberal, 13%, you can imagine that, 13% favored secession, 26% not sure. But notice the young people favor secession about 3 times more than the liberals. A quarter of Republican voters in 2012 presidential election favored secession of their states. Now what that means is there are 80 million Americans that are willing to entertain secession of their states. What they will do about it is another question, but that they think this sort of thing. Now, let's go back to the centennial. We are in the last year of the sesquicentennial. And there is a poll by a respected agency asking people about secession. Now, let's go back to the centennial. Boyd and I and others remember the centennial. Can you imagine a poll being taken in 1961 asking whether anyone wanted to secede? It would not have occurred to anyone. You understand? It wouldn't have occurred. People wouldn't have been against it, they wouldn't have thought of it. They do today. And what this means is that Lincolnian Americanism is fracturing. It still dominates, but it's cracking in a number of ways I don't have time to go into. When you talk about secession, some people fear that if the United States were divided, its parts would not be viable, either in terms of economics or defense. But this is simply not reasonable. Most Americans have no idea how large the states are. I know, because I've talked to people, I have no idea. We're so used to thinking of them like counties that we don't really realize they're huge countries, a lot of them. Let me give you some examples. California is larger in population and GNP than Canada, and yet Canada is certainly a viable country. Texas, if independent, would have the 14th largest GDP in the world out of 193 countries, be number 14. The GDP of Texas and California alone is nearly tied with Germany, which we fought in World War II. And it's larger than Great Britain, and slightly under France. That's Texas and California, just 2 states. Texas and Florida have a GNP larger than Russia. Pennsylvania has a GNP larger than Switzerland. Even Vermont, the smallest American state, has a GDP larger than Latvia or Estonia, both of which bravely seceded from the Soviet Union. We have lost the idea of self-government. Imagine a Jeffersonian America divided into 4 federations of states, just for the fun of it. The North, the South, the Midwest, and the West. The South would have a GNP of 4.9 trillion. It would be the 3rd largest GDP in the world after China and Japan. The North would have 4.2 trillion and would be the 4th largest GDP. The West, with 3.8 trillion, would be 5th. The Midwest, having 2.2 trillion, would be the 10th largest, but not far behind France, Britain, and Brazil, and larger than Russia, which would be the 11th. Each of these 4 federations will be in the top 10 highest GDP countries in the world. Why can't they govern themselves? Why do they have to jump to the snap of Supreme Court justices? Why? Though still dominant, Lincolnian Americanism has exhausted its moral and intellectual resources. In attempting to draw the teeth of state sovereignty as pre-Lincolnians, such as Alexander Hamilton sought to do at the beginning, It has created a regime that can define the limits of its own powers, has created a vast, impenetrable bureaucracy, and has lost entirely the knowledge of how to stop growing. Doesn't know how to do it anymore. You know, a healthy cell, when it gets to a certain point, it splits and divides. It's a cancerous cell that it doesn't know how to stop growing. The central government of the United States today is like an alcoholic or drug addict, and it cannot be fixed by Lincolnian national elections. These function only as enablers, which allow the addict to continue his bad habits. What is needed, and I'm coming to the conclusion, I hope that doesn't sound too cynical. I think I'm describing reality. What is needed when you have an addict like this is an old-fashioned family intervention where the parents, the spouse, the children, the aunts, cousins, grandparents, the minister, the priest intervene to bring the addict back to reality. That's a horrible thing to have to go through in your own living room. But it works a lot of times. In America, that function belongs to the people of the sovereign states to make that intervention. Today, some states are recalling their Jeffersonian inheritance and are debating intervention, either through nullification. I could mention, we don't have time to go into it, a number of states that have passed nullification ordinances and interposition, or through state-initiated amendments to the Constitution under Article 5. Whether they have the civic virtue to follow through is another question. But the point is, with the fracturing of Lincolnian Americanism, there is an emergence, an awakening of this Jeffersonian disposition. You can see it in the polling on secession and on nullification movements. To conclude, all of us have inherited a fractured historical memory due to the Lincolnian Revolution of 1865, which overthrew the founding Jeffersonian Revolution of 1800. Although the Jeffersonian vision has been suppressed, it is still vital. And so all of us are left with this question. How are you to think of your American identity? What does it mean to be an American? What is our history, and what are the prospects for the future? Are you a Jeffersonian American or a Lincolnian American? That's what we have to decide. Thank you.
I think I can say on behalf of everyone, Dr. Livingston, thank you for sharing that educational and insightful speech. And what I take away from it is we seceded once, I guess it can happen again.